Welcome back everyone, Mr. Allen here. I'm just going to quickly introduce the idea of if statements. Now you've seen if statements enough that they shouldn't be too big of a surprise, but we'll sort of cover a few specifics here. What I'm going to do is go through the Visual Basic Express notes. If you don't see them here in your news section, they are always going to be under the shared links, and then under Visual Basic Help Files and Visual Basic Express notes. And then they show up here. So just a couple of things to review first. The things you should already know and should be automatic when you run into them. Input, so anytime you need to get information from the user, your two options are the input box. And again, that's just a command that you type straight into your code. Age equals input box. When it hits that line, the box pops up, says please type in your age. And then whatever you type gets stored as age. Similarly, name. Although name itself, just sort of noticing here, is not a valid variable name. You'd have to make it username or uname, something like that. Name itself is actually a reserved word. The second option is just to put a text box on the screen. Now you'll notice here I have fairly meaningful names for my text boxes, txt age, txt name, and so on. As we move forward, that'll become more and more important. And I'll start to assign communication marks for properly named variables, properly named boxes, labels, and so on. Anything that's actually used in your code should have a new name, should not be text box 1, should not be label 1, and so on. If it's not something that appears in your code, the name is fine as it is. Output, of course, is the opposite of input. These are the different ways to display information on the screen. They can be labels that you draw on your screen, and again, label price, label age, dot text, and so on, or a message box is a pop-up box that you can use as well. The third option that you may not have used yet is a list box, and once you want to have multiple lines in an area, once you want to have multiple things print out, list box is what you'll use, and it's list prices, so in this case the name is list prices, but it's dot items dot add. So whatever the name you give the box, dot items dot add, and then a statement that looks just like all the others. Just a couple things to remember. Visual Basic operators and or. These will start to come up a little bit more often now. And of course suggests that two things have to happen. This has to happen and this has to happen. Or suggests one or the other. And the only time you will ever use and or is in an if statement or later on in a do loop. Those are the only times. You can't use them as statements unto themselves. It's if, this, and that, or loop while this and that. Those are the only times and or come up at all. And then maybe the last thing that's really important is knowing your variable types. Again, they're listed here on page 2. But the ones that really are valuable, string, if you're using variables that are not numbers, integers are values that have no decimal values, and singles have decimal values. The others are basically just a long is a bigger integer, a double is a bigger single, and a Boolean is a true-false value. You probably don't need it yet, but you should know that it's available. So now the if statement itself, really that's what we're interested in today. And the if statement is used very simply whenever we have a choice to make or a decision to make. I want something to happen sometimes, or I want this to happen under certain circumstances and something else under others. And pretty much these 6 boxes here show you the different possibilities. This one is we will only use if you have exactly one thing to check. I'm just checking to see if the mark is greater than 89, and you have exactly one thing to do. I'm going to print that message box. As soon as you have multiple things to do, multiple commands you want to run, you have to go to more of this format with if, then, hit enter, and then list off the various pieces that are going to occur in between the if and the end if, or the if and the else. When you have multiple lines like this to run, the computer will look for the first condition that it finds to be valid. It will run the code in that section, and then it will skip over all the others. So if the mark is greater than or equal to 80, it does this, and then it jumps over the rest. If the mark is greater than or equal to 70, it does this. But recognize that the only time it will get here is if the mark was not greater than or equal to 80. Any other number would already have been handled, and this code would have been skipped. So this will now handle 79 down to 70. Similarly, this handles 69 down to 60, and the else, we should probably know by now, is the condition that runs if none of the others have occurred. So it's a catch-all. If none of these things happen, do this instead. And then probably the only other piece of important information is to recognize that if we are doing ands and ors in our if statement, so if we want to check two conditions, that mark is in this case greater than 100 or less than 0, or in another case if mark is greater than 0 and less than 100, sort of the opposite case, we always have to repeat the variable. We can't simply put if mark is greater than 100 or less than 0. The computer will require to have a complete statement here, mark less than 0, a complete statement here, mark greater than 0, and then it will determine whether both or one of those things occur, and it will either run this section of code or skip down to the else, depending on what it decides. And maybe just the last comment here, I guess. You see that I have an if statement on the outside with a complete if statement on the inside. You can think about your if statements as blocks of code. There will always be an if and an end if, except of course in that first case where we have just a single statement. And that if and that end if and any else ifs and elses in between are always nicely lined up together in a block. They can then fit completely inside of another block as they are here. You could not, however, overlap your end if with your else. It has to be a complete statement that I can see clearly here, and then a complete statement that I can see here. The indentation really helps with lining things up. We know that this if goes with this else, goes with this end if with this else, and this end if. I think that probably covers what we need to see here. Read through the comments, more or less what I've just said, but they're there to help you. Obviously it's important, and don't ignore them. General notes, else handles every other case. We suggested that. And and or can only be used in if statement, or again later on in a do and until loop, but we haven't got there yet. And I guess this is maybe important enough to mention. The way the computer evaluates this is it basically asks the question, is this true, yes or no? If it is true, then it does this stuff here. If it's not true, it skips over it. Similarly, it checks to see whether mark greater than or equal to 80 is true. If it is, it runs this. If it isn't, it comes down here and checks to see if mark greater than or equal to 70 is true, and so on. Okay, so just a quick overview of what if does. The big thing is to understand when to use it, and you use it anytime you have to make a decision. Sometimes do this, sometimes do that. Sometimes do this, sometimes don't do this. And as soon as you can determine that if such and such is going to happen, then I want to do something, you know that it's going to be an if statement.